the life you keep running from, and the one you were made for. There's a version of your life you have imagined, not the perfect version. You have stopped believing in perfect, but a version that feels like yours. A version in which you wake up without the tight knot in your chest, where you do not shrink yourself to fit rooms that were never built for you, where the people around you know who you actually are, not the edited, carefully managed, socially acceptable presentation of you, but the real thing, and they stay anyway, where your needs are not a burden, where your boundaries are not apologies, where you do not need to recover from your own week, because the life you are living does not require vacation from itself. That version of your life is not a fantasy. It is not reserved for people who had easier starts, gentler childhoods, or fewer wounds. It is not dependent on everything going right, on everyone treating you fairly, or on the world rearranging itself into something more manageable. It is built from the inside, from the choices you make about how you see yourself, what you tolerate, who you allow close, and how much of your own power you are willing to claim. This book is about that building. The title, Whole Again, is not a promise that you were once whole and fell apart. Many of the people who will read this were never taught wholeness in the first place. They were taught accommodation, taught to make themselves smaller so that other people could feel larger, taught that their worth was conditional on their productivity, their appearance, their usefulness, their compliance, taught that love was something you earned rather than something you simply deserved by being alive. If that is your history, wholeness is not a return. It is an arrival. For the first time, over 8 chapters, we will work through the 8 most essential dimensions of this journey. We begin with the foundation, the way you see and speak to yourself, the internal relationship that determines every external one. We move through grief and loss, not to dwell there, but to complete what was left incomplete. We explore boundaries, what they actually are, why most of us never learn to set them, and what changes when we do. We examine the art of letting go, of people, outcomes, and versions of yourself that were never truly yours to keep. We look at the psychology of self-worth, where it actually comes from, and how to build it from the ground up rather than borrowing it from other people's opinions. We explore how to rebuild trust in others and, more urgently, in yourself. We investigate the patterns that keep pulling you back to the same dynamics, the same pain, the same ceiling, and how to break them. And finally, we arrive at the life you were made for, not perfect, not painless, but genuinely and completely yours. The Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung wrote something that has echoed across a century because it is so precisely true. The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely, not to fix oneself, not to improve oneself, to accept fully without conditions the person you actually are in this moment, with all the history you carry and all the distance still to travel. That acceptance is not the end of growth. It is the beginning of it, because you cannot build a life on a foundation you are ashamed of. You cannot flourish from a place of self-rejection. You cannot give genuinely to others from an empty interior. Wholeness is not a destination you reach and then stop. It is a way of moving through the world with honesty, with self-compassion, with clear eyes, and with the unshakable knowledge that you belong here, that your life matters, and that everything you need to build something extraordinary is already inside you. Let us begin to find it. Chapter 1. The conversation nobody hears. Rebuilding the relationship with yourself. There's a conversation happening inside you right now. It has been happening since you were old enough to have an inner life, and it will continue until your last breath. It is the most constant, most intimate, and most influential relationship you will ever have, and most people have never examined it for even one deliberate hour. It is the conversation you have with yourself, the running internal commentary on your worth, your capability, your likability, your past decisions, your future prospects, and your fundamental adequacy as a human being. The voice that narrates your experience, judges your performance, predicts your outcomes, and tells you, in tone and content that was installed long before you were old enough to consent, what you are allowed to want, expect, and believe about yourself. For many people, this conversation is brutal, not dramatically, not always explicitly, but with the steady, relentless grind of a machine that never turns off. You are not enough. You are too much. You should have known better. Why would anyone love this? Other people manage this without struggling. What is wrong with you? This is delivered in your own voice, which makes it uniquely convincing. It does not sound like an attacker. It sounds like the truth. It is not the truth. It is a story. An old one, usually. One that was built from the accumulated messages of people and environments that had their own limitations, their own wounds, their own blind spots, and that were never reliable narrators of your actual worth. The psychologist and researcher Dr. Kristen Neff, whose pioneering work on self-compassion at the University of Texas has influenced psychology, education, and medicine worldwide, made a finding so obvious in retrospect that it is astonishing it took formal research to establish. Most people speak to themselves with a harshness they would never direct at someone they loved. They would comfort a friend through failure, through grief, through insecurity, with patience, with gentleness, with the kind of language that acknowledges difficulty without condemning the person experiencing it. And then they turn inward and apply none of that same grace to themselves. Neff's research demonstrated that self-compassion, the practice of treating yourself with the same kindness you would offer a good friend, is not a form of self-indulgence or weakness. It is, in the data, a significantly stronger predictor of psychological resilience, emotional well-being, and sustained motivation than self-esteem. The difference matters. Self-esteem fluctuates with performance and approval. Self-compassion does not depend on succeeding. It is a steady, unconditional baseline of care that says, I am struggling right now, and that is human, and I deserve my own kindness regardless of how this turns out. Think about the athlete who falls in the middle of a race. Two different internal responses are possible. The first says, you idiot. You trained for months and you still fell. Everyone saw. You are an embarrassment. The second says, that hurt. Get up. You can still finish. Both responses acknowledge the fall. Only one of them helps the athlete get back on their feet. The first response is what most people have been trained to call high standards. The second is what the research calls self-compassion, in which, in studies of athletic performance, academic achievement, and professional recovery from failure, consistently produces better long-term outcomes than self-criticism, not because it is softer, because it works. Rebuilding the relationship with yourself begins with the language, the specific words of the internal conversation, not with toxic positivity, the forced, dishonest insistence that everything is fine and you are perfect, but with accuracy and fairness. The same accuracy and fairness you'd extend to a person you genuinely cared about. The writer and activist Audre Lorde, whose life was a sustained act of radical self-acceptance in the face of every conceivable form of external rejection, wrote, caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. She was speaking in the context of her particular battles. As a black woman, a queer woman, a cancer patient navigating a medical system that frequently dismissed her. But the principle extends universally. The choice to treat yourself with care in a world that frequently tells you that your needs are not a priority is not weakness. It is an act of profound resistance. Here's the practice. For the next 7 days, begin to notice the internal conversation, not to fight it. Fighting it only amplifies it. Simply notice it. When the voice arrives with criticism, ask one question. Would I say this, in these words, to someone I loved? If the answer is no, and for most people, for most of their internal dialogue, the answer is no, then reframe it. Not into a lie, into the language you would use with a friend. You failed at this. Not, you are a failure. This was difficult for you. Not, you are weak. You made a mistake here. Not, you are fundamentally broken. The conversation nobody hears is the one that shapes everything. It is worth the attention. It is worth the work. And it will, with time and consistent practice, become the most healing relationship you have ever been in. It begins with you. It always did. Chapter 2. The Incomplete Grief. Finishing what was left unfinished so you can move forward. There's a form of pain that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with the dramatic clarity of acute loss. The phone call that changes everything. The door closing for the last time. The moment of rupture so undeniable that even the most offended mind cannot pretend it is not happening. This pain is older, quieter, and in many ways more insidious. It is the grief that was never allowed to complete. The childhood that should have been different. The parent who was present in body, but absent in the ways that mattered. The version of yourself you had to suppress in order to be acceptable to the people whose love you needed to survive. The dreams you quietly abandoned because the world around you consistently communicated that people like you did not get those things. The relationship that ended not cleanly, but in a long, slow erosion that you tried to prevent and could not. These griefs are real. They are significant. And in most people's lives, they have never been properly grieved because the culture around them had no framework for it, or because the pace of daily life left no room for it, or because the people who should have witnessed it were the very people who caused it, or simply because the grief felt so large and so bottomless that beginning to feel it seemed like a risk that might have no bottom. So it gets carried, unfinished, unwitnessed, unresolved. And it shows up not as sadness, usually, because sadness has been suppressed. It shows up as numbness, as an inability to feel fully present in moments of joy, because the ungrieved pain creates a glass wall between you and your own life. It shows up as anger that seems disproportionate to its triggers, as anxiety that cannot be traced to any current danger, as a persistent, low-grade emptiness that no achievement, no relationship, no accumulation of good things seems able to fill. The psychologist and author Francis Weller, who has spent decades studying grief and its role in human healing, describes what he calls the 5 gates of grief, the different territories of loss that most human beings carry without ever fully entering. The losses we know about and have not yet mourned, the places inside us that have never known love, the sorrows of the world that we absorb without knowing it, what we expected from this life and did not receive, and ancestral grief past, down through generations. He writes, "Grief is the untended wound in the Western psyche." He is right, and the cause of the untended wound is a life half-lived. The person who is functionally present but not fully here, who goes through the motions of connection and achievement and growth while something underneath remains unresolved and unwitnessed. Completing grief does not mean the loss stops mattering. It does not mean you stop loving what you lost, stop wishing things had been different, or stop feeling the shape of what is absent. It means the grief is no longer frozen, no longer stuck at the moment of loss, replaying on loop, preventing you from being fully present in the life that exists now. The poet Mary Oliver, whose luminous attention to the natural world became a lens for understanding the deepest human experiences, wrote in one of her most beloved poems, "Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" She was not asking from a place of pressure or urgency. She was asking from a place of astonishment. The astonishment of someone who had done the work of completing her own grief and arrived at genuine presence, who could look at her actual life, in the actual moment, and find it wild and precious rather than burdened and insufficient. That astonishment is available, but it usually requires passing through the gate of what was lost rather than around it. There are 3 things that incomplete grief needs in order to complete. The first is acknowledgement, the simple, honest recognition that something real was lost, that it mattered, and that the loss had a cost. Not minimizing it, not comparing it to worse losses, not explaining why you should be over it by now. Just, this happened, it was real and it hurt. The second is expression, finding some form through which the grief can move out of the body and into the world. Writing, speaking, moving, creating, any form that gives the grief somewhere to go. The body holds what the mind refuses to process. Somatic therapists, movement practitioners, and researchers in trauma processing all confirm the same thing. Grief that is only thought about stays stuck. Grief that is expressed through the body begins to move. The third is witness, being seen in the grief by someone who can hold space without trying to fix it, minimize it, or rush it to a resolution that would be more comfortable for them than true for you. This might be a therapist, a trusted friend, a grief group, a journal that becomes a witness when no person is available. The grief needs to be seen to complete. Witness sorrow transforms in a way that private, suppressed sorrow cannot. The Japanese ceramic tradition of kintsugi repairs broken pottery with gold, making the cracks not just visible but beautiful, the most precious element of the piece. The breaks do not diminish the bowl. They become its history, its character, its particular beauty. Your incomplete grief is not a flaw to be hidden. It is a crack waiting for gold. Begin the witnessing. The gold is yours. Chapter 3. The Invisible Fence. What boundaries actually are and why they change everything. If you ask most people what a boundary is, they will tell you it is something you say to someone else, a line you draw, a limit you communicate, a statement about what you will and will not accept. And they are partially right. But this definition misses the most important element, the one that determines whether a boundary is real or whether it's simply a wish expressed in firm language. A boundary is not primarily a communication. It is a decision about your own behavior. When you say to someone, if you speak to me that way again, I will end this conversation. That is only a boundary if you actually end the conversation when they speak that way again. The moment you do not, the moment you absorb the behavior and continue the conversation without consequence, the boundary has not been set. What has been said is a rule the other person now knows they can break without consequence. This distinction matters enormously because most people who describe having boundary problems do not actually struggle to identify where their limits are. They know exactly where they are. They can articulate them clearly. The struggle is in enforcing them, in doing the thing that follows when the boundary is crossed. And the reason for that struggle, almost without exception, is not weakness of character. It is an unexamined belief that their needs are less important than the other person's comfort, and that enforcing a consequence will cost them a connection they cannot afford to lose. Dr. Henry Cloud and Dr. John Townsend, clinical psychologists whose research on boundaries has reached millions of people, describe the function of boundary with a simple metaphor, a property line. You are responsible for everything inside your property, your emotions, your choices, your responses, your values. You are not responsible for what happens inside someone else's property. A boundary is a line that makes clear where one person's responsibility ends and another's begins. It is not a wall designed to keep people out. It is a fence with a gate, one that you control, and that opens when you choose to let it. Most people who struggle with boundaries were not taught this distinction in childhood. They were taught, explicitly or implicitly, that managing other people's emotions was their responsibility, that keeping the peace was worth the cost of their own needs, that love looked like boundless availability, unconditional accommodation, and the constant compression of their own wants in deference to someone else's. They learned to read the room before they had learned to read themselves. The result, in adulthood, is a person who can sense everyone else's emotional state with exquisite sensitivity and who has almost no practice at all in articulating or protecting their own. Who says yes when they mean no, because the guilt of the no feels worse than the resentment of the yes. Who absorbs other people's pain as though it were their own to fix. Who then wonders why they feel so exhausted, so invisible, so quietly desperate for someone to notice that they are disappearing. Brené Brown, whose research on vulnerability and shame has reached tens of millions of readers, arrived at a finding that surprised even her. The most compassionate people she interviewed were also the most boundaried, not the least. The assumption that compassion requires boundlessness, that care means giving everything, turned out to be precisely backwards. The people who consistently gave from a place of genuine generosity rather than fearful compliance were the people who had clear, consistent limits, because they knew what they had to give, and they gave it freely rather than from depletion. She put it simply, daring to set boundaries is about having the courage to love ourselves, even when we risk disappointing others. Setting a boundary is not an act of aggression. It is not selfishness. It is not cruelty to the person whose behavior you are no longer accepting. It is an honest statement about what you need in order to remain in relationship with them or at all. A boundary protects a connection by ensuring it is built on honesty rather than performance. The relationship that can only survive if you have no needs is not a relationship. It is a role. Here is the practice. Identify one area of your life where you consistently feel resentment, exhaustion, or the sense that you are giving more than is being returned. Resentment, the researcher and author in Lamott has observed, is the smoke alarm of the violated boundary. It is not a character flaw. It is information. Ask yourself, what would I need in this situation to feel respected rather than used? What behavior would I need to see change? And what would I actually do, not say but do, if that behavior continued? Start there. One boundary. One consequence you are willing to enforce. The fence does not need to be built all at once. It is built post by post, decision by decision, one honest act of self-respect at a time. Chapter 4. The Open Hand. The Art of Letting Go Without Losing Yourself. There's an ancient Chinese finger trap, a woven bamboo tube, just wide enough to insert both index fingers, one from each end. The trap works on a single principle. The harder you pull to free yourself, the tighter it grips. The weave tightens around both fingers as the tension increases. The only way to release yourself is to do the counterintuitive thing, to push inward toward the trap, relaxing the weave so the fingers can slip free. Letting go works the same way. The tighter you grip what you're trying to release, the more you analyze it, resist it, argue with it, demand it be different, the more firmly it holds you. The release comes not from force, but from the deliberate, conscious choice to stop pulling and open the hand. Letting go is the most misunderstood practice in personal growth. Most people understand it as forgetting, as approval, or as the permanent erasure feeling. They hear let go and think, I am being asked to pretend this did not hurt, to act as if the betrayal was acceptable, the loss was trivial, the years were not wasted. And they resist because that would be a lie, and they have already told themselves too many lies to survive. But letting go is none of those things. Letting go does not mean the thing did not happen. It does not mean it did not matter. It does not mean the person who hurt you was right or that the loss was not real. It means you are choosing to stop allowing what happened in the past to determine who you become in the future. It means you are releasing your grip on the story, not the memory of what happened, but the relentless, exhausting mental litigation of it, the replaying, the re-arguing, the parallel universe of what should have happened, the perpetual return to a moment that is over, seeking a different ending that is never going to come. The Buddhist teacher Pema Chodron describes attachment, the clinging to people, outcomes, and versions of reality that are no longer available, as the root of suffering, not because the things we attach to are bad, but because impermanence is the fundamental nature of existence. Everything changes. Everyone leaves eventually, in one way or another. Every outcome we hope for either arrives differently than we imagined or does not arrive at all. The mind that requires permanence in an impermanent world will spend its entire existence in pain. The mind that can hold things gently, with love, with care, but without the death grip of necessity, moves through the world in an entirely different way. She writes, we think that the point is to pass the test or overcome a problem, but the truth is that things don't really get resolved. They come together and they fall apart. Then they come together again and fall apart again. Letting go is a practice of making peace with the falling apart, without rushing the coming together, without demanding that things be different, and without making the falling apart mean something permanent and terrible about you. Think about the people who are carrying something heavy right now, and almost everyone is carrying something. The relationship that ended 2 years ago and still feels open. The parent whose approval never came and probably never will. The opportunity that was missed. The path not taken. The version of a life that was hoped for and did not materialize. The injury, the illness, the loss that rewrote the story in ways that were not chosen. None of these things are small. All of them deserve to be grieved, which is different from being carried indefinitely. Grief moves through you when you let it. The thing you carry by refusing to grieve stays with you everywhere, adding its weight to every room you enter and every relationship you attempt. The American poet and essayist David Whyte writes about what he calls the conversational nature of reality, the idea that our lives are not a fixed narrative but an ongoing dialogue between what we intend and what actually is. To let go is to rejoin that dialogue honestly, to put down the script of how things should have been and pick up the actual conversation of what is. Here's the practice. Identify what you are holding. Name it specifically, not my past, but the exact thing, the person, the decision, the loss, the version of yourself you keep trying to resurrect. Then ask, what is holding this cost me? In presence, in energy, in the quality of my attention, in the current moment of my actual life? And ask finally, what will become possible if I open my hand? You do not have to let go of the love, only the grip. The open hand can still receive. The closed fist cannot. Chapter 5. The Source Within. Building self-worth that doesn't depend on anyone else. In 1943, the psychologist Abraham Maslow published a paper proposing that human motivations could be organized into a hierarchy, a pyramid of needs, from the most basic physical requirements for survival at the base to the experience of self-actualization at the peak. The paper became one of the most cited works in all of psychology. But the element most people remember, the hierarchy itself, is actually less interesting than something Maslow proposed later in his lesser-known work on what he called intrinsic motivation. Maslow noticed that the people who had reached self-actualization, the individuals in his research who seemed most fully alive, most genuinely themselves, most capable of sustained creativity, love, and contribution, shared a characteristic that had nothing to do with their circumstances. It was an orientation, an internal compass. They were, in his description, growth-oriented rather than deficiency-oriented, meaning they were not primarily driven by what they lacked and needed to acquire from the external world, but by what they had and wanted to express. He was describing, in psychological language, the difference between borrowed self-worth and intrinsic self-worth, and that difference is one of the most consequential in human life. Borrowed self-worth is constructed from external material, other people's approval, achievements, physical appearance, social comparison, relationship status, productivity, and performance. It is not that these things are unimportant. It is that they are inherently unstable. Approval fluctuates. Achievements plateau or are surpassed. Appearance changes. Relationships end. Productivity has bad days. The person whose sense of worth is primarily built from this external material lives on a foundation that shifts with every change in circumstance, confident when approval is flowing, devastated when it is not. Intrinsic self-worth cannot be given, and therefore cannot be taken away. It is not earned. It is recognized. In the moment that you stop looking outside yourself for evidence of your own value, and simply acknowledge that you have inherent worth as a human being, not because of what you produce or how you appear or how many people choose you, but because you are alive and conscious and navigating this extraordinarily difficult experience of being human with whatever tools you were given. This sounds simple. For most people, it is the hardest work they will ever do. The theologian and civil rights leader Howard Thurman, whose writings on the inner life and human dignity influenced an entire generation of activists, including Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., wrote, "There is something in every one of you that waits and listens for the sound of the genuine in yourself. It is the only true guide you will ever have." He was pointing at the same thing, the interior source that does not depend on external validation to be real. Building this source requires dismantling the external scaffolding slowly and deliberately, not by abandoning the things that bring genuine satisfaction, but by examining whether your relationship with them is one of enjoyment or one of dependency. Do you exercise because it makes you feel good, or because you are afraid of how you look without it? Do you work hard because the work means something to you, or because you cannot tolerate the anxiety of not performing? Do you seek connection because you genuinely want it, or because you cannot be alone with yourself? The questions are not accusations. They are tools. They reveal the architecture of your self-worth, so you can examine which parts are built on solid ground and which are built on sand. Toni Morrison, one of the greatest writers of the 20th century and a Nobel laureate whose work explored the deepest wounds of the American psyche, said in a commencement address, "You are not the work you do. You are the person you are." She was speaking to graduates about to enter a culture that would measure their worth primarily by their professional output. She was giving them permission to know, beneath that measurement, that it was never the whole truth. Start building the intrinsic foundation today, not by stopping effort or achievement or connection, but by practicing, in small daily moments, the recognition that your worth does not change with your performance. When something you worked hard on fails, notice the instinct to collapse into self-judgment and practice instead. My worth is not located here. When someone does not choose you, does not call back, does not approve, does not stay, notice the instinct to use as evidence of your inadequacy and practice instead. Their choice is about them and their reality, not about my value. The source within is not built in a single act of decision. It is built in 1,000 small moments of refusing to hand your worth to something outside yourself. Each refusal is a brick. The foundation grows. Chapter 6. The Rebuilt Bridge. How to trust again after you have been broken. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from being in rooms full of people and feeling completely unable to reach them. Not because you lack the desire for connection. The desire is enormous, consuming, sometimes the loudest thing in a room, but because somewhere along the way, trust was broken so completely, so formatively, so repeatedly, that the bridge between yourself and other people feels structurally unsafe. You approach it, you test it with a tentative foot, and then, because of the look, A tone, a silence that lasts too long, a pattern that reminds you of something older and more painful. You step back, and you call yourself broken for it. You are not broken. You are protected. The problem is not the protection itself. The capacity to protect yourself from harm is not a pathology. It is intelligence. The problem is when the protection that once kept you safe begins to cost you the things that make life worth living. Genuine intimacy, the kind of friendship where you can be fully seen, the experience of being known and loved in your actual complexity rather than your curated presentation. The research on trust and betrayal recovery is clear on one point that most people find uncomfortable. Rebuilding trust does not begin with the person who broke it. It begins with you. Specifically, it begins with rebuilding trust in yourself. This is a distinction most people have never considered. When trust is broken by another person, the pain is naturally directed outward, toward them, their choices, their failures, their betrayal. But the deeper wound, the one that persists long after the specific relationship is ended, is often an internal one. The loss of confidence in your own judgment. The tormenting question, how did I not see this coming? Why did I trust someone who turned out to be untrustworthy? What is wrong with my ability to read people? The answer, almost always, is nothing is wrong with your ability to read people. Something went wrong with your willingness to believe what you were reading. You saw the signs. Most people who are hurt by betrayal, in retrospect, recognize that the signals were there. What they did not do was trust their own perception of those signals. They overrode their instinct in favor of hope, need, or the desperate desire to believe in the version of the person they had already invested themselves in. Rebuilding trust in yourself means rebuilding the connection to your own perception, practicing the radical act of believing what you actually see and feel, rather than what you wish were true. The philosopher and novelist Ayn Rand, regardless of the controversies around her broader philosophy, articulated something precise about this. The hardest thing to explain is the glaringly evident which everybody has decided not to see. Self-trust is the willingness to name the glaringly evident even when everyone, including the voice in your own head, is telling you not to. From that foundation of restored self-trust, rebuilding trust in others becomes possible. Not naive trust, not the unconditional openness of someone who has not yet been hurt, but earned trust extended incrementally in proportion to what is actually demonstrated over time. Maya Angelou, who was profoundly betrayed in her earliest years in ways that could permanently close her to connection, developed a philosophy of trust so precise and so honest it bears sitting with. I don't trust people who don't love themselves and tell me I love you. There's an African saying which is, be careful when a naked person offers you a shirt. She was not teaching cynicism. She was teaching discernment, the specific, practice skill of distinguishing genuine capacity for connection from the performance of it. People who have not done their own interior work cannot give what they have not built. Their offering, however warmly intended, is a shirt they do not have. The rebuilt bridge is not a return to the bridge that broke. It is something new, designed for what you have learned, built on a foundation of self-knowledge, and open to people who demonstrate, over time and in behavior, that they are capable of crossing it with care. Trust is not a decision made once. It is a practice sustained daily, and it begins always with a decision to trust the one person you cannot afford to betray, yourself. Chapter 7. The pattern beneath the pattern. Breaking the cycles that keep you returning to the same pain. There is a phenomenon in psychology that is so common it has been given multiple names across different theoretical frameworks, but which every person with any significant self-awareness will recognize immediately. The repetition compulsion. The almost supernatural tendency to recreate, in new contexts, the same essential dynamic that caused the original wound. The woman who grew up with an emotionally unavailable father and consistently finds herself drawn to men who cannot offer emotional intimacy. The man who was parentified as a child, who learned to earn love by being responsible for everyone else's emotional state, and who, in adulthood, can only feel valued when he is needed and depleted. The person who was raised in an environment of chronic instability and who, despite genuinely wanting peace, consistently creates or gravitates toward chaos. The one who was never allowed to be angry and who, in adulthood, is surrounded by people who are always angry on their behalf. These are not coincidences. They are not bad luck. They are the psyche's attempt to master what was never resolved, to find, in the present, the solution to the pain of the past. Unfortunately, without awareness, the attempt always fails, because the solution to an old wound is not to recreate the wound. It is to finish the grieving, understand the pattern, and make a different choice. Sigmund Freud, who identified the repetition compulsion in the early 20th century, described it as the unconscious tendency to repeat painful experiences in a hope of eventually achieving a different outcome. The person does not consciously choose to repeat the pattern. They are drawn to it because it feels familiar, and familiar to the nervous system trained by early experience feels like home, even when home was painful, perhaps especially then. The neuroscientist and trauma researcher Bessel van der Kolk, whose decades of work with trauma survivors produced one of the most important books on human psychology of the 21st century, described this in the language of the body. The body keeps a score. The nervous system does not file old experiences in the past the way a librarian files old books on a high shelf. It keeps them in the present, in patterns of arousal and shutdown, in the automatic responses that fire before consciousness can intervene, in the physical sensations that arise in the presence of familiar feeling people and situations. Understanding your pattern requires three things. First, visibility, the ability to see the pattern clearly enough to recognize it in real time rather than only in retrospect. This usually requires some form of reflective practice, journaling, therapy, honest conversation with someone who knows you well enough to name what they see. The pattern is by definition unconscious. It does not announce itself. It must be brought into the light. Second, compassion. The recognition that the pattern was not a character defect. It was an adaptation. It made sense once. It was the best the younger version of you could do with the tools they had in the environment they were in. The person who learned to shrink themselves to keep the peace learned that because shrinking kept them safe. The person who learned to perform and achieve to earn love learned that because performance was what got them warmth. The adaptation made sense in context. The work now is to recognize that the context has changed. Third, choice. The daily, deliberate practice of making a different decision when a familiar pull arrives. Not forever, not in every context, but in this moment, with this person, in this situation. The neurological research on habit change confirms what Stoic philosophy proposed 2,000 years ago. The neural pathway of the old pattern weakens when it is not followed, and the new pathway strengthens with each deliberate choice. The pattern does not change in a single act of will. It changes in accumulated moments of choosing differently. The poet Rumi, whose 13th century Sufi poetry contains psychological insight of remarkable depth and precision, wrote in the translation of Coleman Barks, "Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there." He was pointing at the space beyond the old narratives, the judgments, the fixed stories, the patterns inherited and compelled, the field where something new is possible. You can get to the field, not by willing the pattern away, by seeing it clearly, understanding its origin with compassion, and choosing differently, one moment at a time, until the new path becomes the one your feet find naturally. The pattern is not your destiny. It is your history. And history, understood deeply enough, becomes the very foundation from which something entirely new can be built. Chapter 8. The life you were made for. Arriving at wholeness. Not perfect, but completely yours. There is a moment in the life of anyone who has done the kind of work this book asks for. The honest examination of the internal conversation. The willingness to complete old grief. The courage to set and hold real boundaries. The practice of releasing what cannot be controlled. The building of intrinsic self-worth. The patient rebuilding of trust. The deliberate dismantling of old patterns. There is a moment that cannot be scheduled or forced, that arrives quietly and without announcement, that most people do not recognize immediately for what it is. It is the moment when you realize you are not performing your life anymore, not performing for parents who may not even still be watching, not performing for an imagined audience of critics, not performing the version of yourself you decided, at some point in your history, was the safest or most acceptable or most likely to be loved. Just being here, in this moment, as this person, with this particular, unrepeatable, imperfect, completely sufficient combination of strengths and limitations and history and hope that is uniquely you. Wholeness is not the absence of damage. Nobody who has lived any kind of honest life arrives at maturity without damage. The question was never whether you will be marked by your experience. The question is whether the marks define you or whether they become part of the texture of a life that is genuinely, fully, courageously your own. The Japanese philosophy of wabi-sabi, the aesthetic of imperfection, impermanence, and incompleteness, finds beauty not despite the cracks and the weathering and the asymmetries, but because of them. The tea bowl that is slightly lopsided, the wooden beam with its natural grain and knots, the garden that is not perfectly manicured. These things are beautiful precisely because they carry the evidence of time, of use, of the real world pressing against them and leaving its mark. You are like this, not in spite of your history, because of it. The Nobel Prize-winning author Toni Morrison, whose entire body of work was an act of radical truth-telling about what it means to be human in all its complexity, said something that belongs at the center of any conversation about wholeness. You want to fly, you got to give up the shit that weighs you down. She was not being flippant. She was being precise. The weight is real, the unexamined beliefs, the unfinished grief, the boundaries never set, the patterns never seen. And the giving up is real work, not a moment of decision, but a sustained, daily practice of choosing a life that is actually yours over the one that was assigned to you. The life you were made for has specific features that no one can define for you. It is not someone else's version of success, freedom, or happiness transposed onto your existence. It has the texture of your particular curiosity, your specific form of love, your own way of finding meaning in the ordinary. It makes demands that are uniquely yours. For the particular kind of solitude you need, the particular kind of connection that restores you, the particular kind of work that makes you feel most alive and most useful. You may not know yet what all of those features are. That is not a failure of self-knowledge. It is an invitation to pay attention, the specific, patient, loving attention to yourself that this book has been advocating from its first page. To listen for the genuine in yourself, as Howard Thurman put it, to be willing to hear it even when it tells you something inconvenient or costly or frightening. Because the cost of not hearing it, the cost of continuing to live the performed, accommodated, contracted version of life, is not safety. It is slow, invisible diminishment, the gradual compression of a self that was always meant to expand. You were not built for the small life, not the one where your needs are always last, your voice is always quietest, your space is always smallest, your worth is always borrowed, and therefore always at risk of being repossessed. You were not built to spend your existence managing other people's discomfort at the expense of your own becoming. The psychologist Abraham Maslow, whose work we visited in Chapter 5, described self-actualization as the full use and exploitation of talents, capacities, potentialities. He believed it was the birthright of every human being, not the privilege of the exceptional, but the natural outcome of life lived in genuine contact with oneself. The tragedy, he thought, was not that most people failed to achieve it. The tragedy was that most people never tried, because they had absorbed, early and deeply, the message that their authentic self was not safe to express. This book has been an extended argument against that message, against the idea that your needs are a burden, your boundaries are aggression, your grief is self-indulgence, your patterns are your destiny, your wounds define you, and your worth must be earned daily from external sources that are never quite satisfied. None of it is true. It was never true. What is true is this: you are here. You have survived everything that was supposed to stop you. You have done the work, or begun it, which is the same thing in terms of what it costs and what it opens. You are reading the final pages of a book about wholeness, which means some part of you has always believed it was possible. That part was right. Ralph Waldo Emerson, the American philosopher and poet who spent his life articulating the radical dignity of the individual human soul, wrote, "To be yourself in a world that is constantly trying to make you something else is the greatest accomplishment. Not the most dramatic, not the most externally impressive, the greatest. This is your life, not the assigned version, not the performed version, not the version that fits neatly into what was decided for you before you were old enough to decide for yourself. The version that is whole, that is honest, that is yours. You have always been enough to build it. Begin. Conclusion. The ongoing arrival. Wholeness is not a destination with a clear arrival time and a definitive moment when the work is done. If you've been waiting for that moment, the day when everything feels resolved and the old wounds stop mattering and the patterns are permanently broken and the self-doubt is entirely silent, you will wait a long time. What wholeness actually looks like in practice is more like a direction than a destination. A steady, patient movement toward more authentic, more compassionate, more honest engagement with the one life you have. Days when you catch the internal critic before it finishes its sentence. Moments when you notice the familiar pull the old pattern and choose differently. Conversations where you say what you actually need instead of what you've always said. Relationships that feel like home rather than performance. A growing capacity to be alone with yourself without needing to escape. These are not dramatic transformations. They are quiet ones, and they accumulate, brick by brick, choice by choice, day by day, into a life that is recognizably, unmistakably, completely yours. Carl Jung, with whom this book opened, also wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." The privilege, not the burden, not the achievement. The privilege, the extraordinary, unrepeatable gift of having one life in which to do this particular, difficult, luminous work. You have already begun. The beginning is everything. Go gently, go honestly, go whole.